Stop the world!
Of course, you want to protect your secrets, and that's completely correct. But a certain degree of intelligence transparency is helpful because it dispels fear of surprise attack, which is very important as we understand.
Welcome to Stop the World, the ASPI podcast on security and international affairs. I'm Olivia Nelson.
And I'm David Rowe.
The Sydney Dialogue is just days away, Dave, and we have one final episode of the Sydney Dialogue Summit Sessions to sneak in before the event kicks off on Monday. And I have to say, I'm pretty excited about this one.
I bet you are, Liv. I know you're a big fan of the interviewee, Shashank Joshi, the Economist's defence editor. It's a cracking interview. He's speaking with ASPI's executive director, Justin Bassi. Shashank is very impressively knowledgeable on topics across defence and security, intelligence, technology, history, and even the future.
Justin and Shashank cover a lot of ground, from the impact of AI on defence and intelligence operations to the implications of the No Limits partnership between Russia and China. They discuss the role of technology in Russia's war on Ukraine and the lessons to be learned by the rest of the world.
We want to protect legitimate, organic, free speech by our nationals. But in the digital world, our adversaries are also making that problem much harder by injecting themselves into these debates, often in covert and malign ways.
They also discuss the rise of extremism and terrorism, how social media is amplifying and enabling these threats and actors, and debates around the need to protect free speech while simultaneously preventing violence and ensuring public safety.
The machines can still do incredible things, but the humans have to know what to ask of them, what to build into them, and that is where the experimentation comes in.
It's a great conversation that really covers a variety of issues across defence, national security and technology. Over to Justin and Shashank.
Shashank Joshi is the Economist defence editor. Prior to joining the Economist in 2018, he was Senior Research Fellow with our good friends RUSI, the Royal United Services Institute, as well as Research Associate at Oxford University's Changing Character of War program, and a Kennedy Scholar from Britain to the United States at Harvard. As the Economist defence editor since 2018, Shashank really has seen, and in many cases been at the forefront of, the world's realisation that economics and security cannot be separated. In many instances, it took war or crisis for democracies to finally accept there could be no such separation, as seen by Russia's war on Ukraine and China's economic coercion worldwide. But to date, it can at least be argued that we've taken a better late than never approach. But does the same hold true for the intersection of technology and security? Have we truly grasped the connection between the two, or are we unrealistically and dangerously holding on to an ideal in which democratic governments and intelligence agencies should only cross into the tech sector after threats have been realised? Are the benefits of connectivity seeing us sleepwalk into an online world of disinformation and disintegration, resulting in increased radicalisation, incitement of violence, terrorism, cyber attacks, and foreign interference? Indeed, we're now only days away from the Sydney Dialogue, a summit that brings together governments, industry, and civil society to better understand the impact and consequences of technology on society and security. And it is a key aspect of Shashank's latest report, entitled The Tools of Global Spycraft Have Changed. So Shashank, welcome to ASPI's podcast, Stop the World.
Thank you very much for having me, Justin. Honoured to be on.
Wonderful. And I am keen to cover all those aspects of tech and security. But let's start there with your latest piece, which really is a tour de force of the intersection of tech and intelligence. You cover the history of intel and technology, development of computers and machine learning, the impact of advancements from radio to the internet and encryption on all areas of intelligence, from SIGINT to HUMINT to GEOINT. And what you present is, in my view, a must-read for both those within the intelligence community and those who are just interested in it. So can you take our listeners through the inspiration for the report and whether it's left you feeling optimistic or pessimistic about our future?
Well, Justin, thank you so much for the very kind words about the report. This was prompted by a sense that, yes, technology has always been integral to intelligence, right? You can think back to kind of invisible inks thousands of years ago to write coded messages. You can think back to Colossus, the world's first programmable computer built here in England to crack Nazi codes, spy satellites. And some of that has always come from the outside, right? So the plastics industry in the 50s led to advances in miniaturization of gadgets for the CIA. transistors led to small, compact agent communication devices. So that's always been the case. No dispute about that. But there's something different about the age we're in, I feel. And you can push back on this, Justin, if you think I'm wrong here. But, my sense is that the technologies we saw, particularly at the height of the Cold War, deployed in the intelligence contest, these were very big, exquisite technologies, supercomputers to crack codes in SIGINT agencies, signals intelligence agencies, spy planes like U-2 that could fly very fast, very high, that were, one of a kind. And the Corona satellites, the spy satellites that made the world's surface semi-transparent through the Cold War. Those were elite projects. They were the preserve of big, well-resourced spy agencies, or in our cases, just in the UK and Australia, their allies. And they were used to spy on a world that mostly didn't really have that technology itself, right? They were statist projects. They were elite projects. And I think what's really different today, and this is, I think, the common thread that runs through the report I've done, is that digital technology is now pretty much in every corner of life, right? And I won't labor the point, but if you look at smartphones, there are 8 billion plus smartphones worldwide. They embody a microelectronics revolution in which the cost of cameras, the cost of microphones, the cost of GPS receivers, the cost of stuff we, Justin, you and I probably didn't even think about or talk about 15 years ago, vibrometers, accelerometers, stuff that you were probably interested in if you were a North Korean missile scientist, but maybe not a kind of ordinary person sitting in Sydney or London. These are now kind of in every pocket, and you have intelligence factories in every pocket, and the algorithms and computing power that make sense of that torrential data coming off that attack surface, out of that digital infrastructure, has become exponentially more capable and efficient. So at the macro level, that is what I think is the animating question, the animating theme of this report.
Fabulous. And not only do I not disagree with you, I completely agree with you that the world that we were in the post-World War II environment, all the way through the Cold War and post-Cold War, these areas that you mentioned, a high-end technology, the world of intelligence, was largely a major power issue, at least an issue around that governments controlled. An area, a sector of a prime example is space, where 20, 30 years ago, people would have been convinced that it would remain a government issue. And now, of course, has been so commercialized. And we didn't have the first iPhone until 2007. Social media wasn't around. So it really has become public. And so I do agree with you that we're in a different age. Your report goes to so many of those aspects. It begins in a wonderful, terrifying way with the revelation of how Chinese intelligence agencies were using malware implanted in internet-connected CCTV cameras in Taiwan and South Korea to communicate with the Indian power grid. As you say, not just to gather data, but presumably to enable future sabotage. And the cameras in Taiwan and South Korea, you report, that are among more than 1 billion installed globally, and the billions of sensors in our phones, computers, cars, and televisions. So it really was a great way to start the report because it's so fascinating, but also frightening. What, Shashank, should that tell us? That everything we do, whether it's in cyberspace itself or just when we're connected to it, is it some type of risk of attack, disruption, or sabotage?
I think it's more than that. I think I liked this story because it is the fusion of a lot of different strands of this topic, right? Yes, part of the story is that everything is digitized. I mean, why the hell is the Indian power grid connected to the wider internet? How is it even possible that a CCTV camera in South Korea or Taiwan can somehow make its way to the vital part of the Indian power grid, right? There's something wrong there, and that's to do with the insecure way we have built the internet and digital devices. But that's just a microcosm for kind of the wider vulnerability of our digital infrastructure, wherever it may be. But there's more than that, right? First of all, what is the stepping stone for this Chinese attack? It's a surveillance camera. That is really embodies the idea that surveillance technology, digital surveillance technology, is everywhere. And that, in a very specific way, has made life significantly harder for human intelligence officers, for the case officers in human intelligence agencies, human agencies that have to operate abroad, that have to recruit agents, meet agents, pick up their information, connect with them. Doing all of that unobserved, undetected, safely is a tougher ask than it was prior to the age of ubiquitous digitized surveillance cameras. And that's before we get into the question, Justin, of these cameras performing facial recognition or gait analysis, even on board the very camera itself, thanks to edge processing, right? And then the final point is, which is in some ways the most interesting, is who is detecting this remarkable attack? It isn't, the ASD, it's not GCHQ, it's not NSA, although maybe they were picking this up as well. This is a private company sitting in Massachusetts in America. It's a company that is effectively, I think really, is a small SIGINT agency unto itself, of a kind that would not have existed prior to the internet, right? This is a company called Recorded Future, but there are many other companies out there that do similar things as well. And they hoover up what we would call command and control nodes, the stepping stones used by Russian and Chinese hackers. They hoover up stolen login details found on the dark web to see whose details have been stolen. They hoover up data on companies, on shipping manifests, all these things. And so the lesson I take from that is that the boundary between secret intelligence and non-secret intelligence has also blurred significantly, in part as a result of this digital torrent of information we've been discussing.
Let's talk about that boundary that is seemingly now collapsed. You just mentioned, and you write about it in this latest report, about how recent technology has made intelligence, in particular human intelligence, more difficult. Are you saying, and has your research suggested to you, that the current technological revolution, the different tech age, as you say, that we're in, including AI and other surveillance tools, is it the end of human as we know it, or is it just the next evolution which will just require our intelligence agencies to adapt and be better?
I'm generally of the view that it's an evolution, and I'll answer this in a couple of ways, Justin. One is to say that even if you are a proponent of the view that technical intelligence, whether that's cyber, whether that's electronic intelligence, whether that's something else, is going to be the dominant mode of gathering intelligence in our world, you still need the human stuff, right? This is what I think people who are not in the intelligence community perhaps don't appreciate, which is the symbiotic relationship between the different intelligence disciplines. And this goes back a long way, right? I remember reading a story, I think it was through one of the official historians, prior to the Second World War. Poland has compromised Germany's Enigma machine, right? The cipher machine that is encoding their traffic. That is not just because they're fantastic mathematicians and great cryptanalysts. It's because a German officer has also given instructions and cipher settings for the machine to the French intelligence service, which then passes it on to the Poles. So what's the relevance of that? The relevance is that technical intelligence often depends on human agents. And that extends to the current day. Who do we think planted a USB stick or the malicious code onto Iranian nuclear plants in the Stuxnet attack? It was most likely a human agent. And so many of these difficult to access targets are not things, I think people think that people sitting in hoods with computer screens just remotely hacking their way to these targets. I'm sure that happens a great deal, but human intelligence is still critical to enabling other kinds. And I think the second point here is that let's not forget human intelligence has moved in waves. In the 1980s, Stansfield Turner, who was the head of the CIA, he was very down on human intelligence. He said, basically, we can't do it. Americans are no good at this, unlike the Russians who are good at living abroad. Why bother with this? Let's just focus on satellites. And of course, they realized when the war on terror began that you needed people to penetrate jihadist groups. You still needed human intelligence. And the most telling conversation I had on this topic, Justin, was with a historian called David Geo, who's at King's College, but he's not only a historian who studied the Penkovsky case, the famous Soviet mole, Oleg Penkovsky, but also was a former CIA officer. So he kind of understands both sides. And he says, look, yes, it's getting difficult, but there are always gaps. And he said, ultimately, I would rather operate in modern Beijing than in Cold War Moscow, which I thought was incredibly striking, which tells you that this suffocating technical surveillance, it's difficult, it's challenging, but we have dealt with suffocating technical surveillance before, and we should be very careful of assuming our age is completely distinct and unique.
Yeah, we've had David Geo on this podcast before. I completely agree. Fascinating to listen to. Also agree with you in terms of being an evolution rather than the end of what we know. I was in the Australian national security community when the Snowden revelations happened, that there are always events that we think of at the time as going to be an existential threat. And maybe it's the old saying of that things are never quite as good or bad as you think they are.
SIGINT is still alive a decade on, isn't it?
It is just some hurdles that need to be jumped over. But I think that the tech advancement that we're seeing and the level of distrust that people have with what they're reading online, disinformation and propaganda, I think what we'll see is that intelligence, secret intelligence, is actually going to become even more important to be able to identify what actually is disinformation and what is information, accurate information, and perhaps what's a mix of the two. So to actually try to counter the level of distrust that we have, I think that governments are going to once again become more reliant on our intel communities, even though there is actually far more available in open source than ever before. It goes to another line that really stuck out to me in your report, Shashank, where you say, in a world where great power war looms larger, good intelligence can help bring stability. Can you take us through what you mean here?
It's interesting you mentioned that, Justin. I was reading Chris Taylor's recent report for ASPI on official histories on intelligence, which is a great report, really reflecting on the lessons that Western intelligence agencies have learned while writing official histories, both in Australia, but also in the UK. And he touches on American examples as well. And the reason this is relevant to your question is because I was reading last year or the year before that, John Ferris's official history of GCHQ. And there's a line in that stuck with me, and it said that SIGINT was one part of a global competition against able enemies in many areas. Soviet HUMINT crippled UK-USA SIGINT. Western HUMINT never returned the favor, but it's basically saying that, this was an intense competition. But the point he makes is that NATO wanted Soviet SIGINT to be decent or good. That's his phrase, decent or good, because, and I'm quoting, that status helped to achieve its strategic aim, deterrence. And I thought that was so interesting, right? Because we think of intelligence as something you don't want the other side to see what you're doing. Of course, you want to protect your secrets, and that's completely correct. But a certain degree of intelligence transparency is helpful because it dispels fear of surprise attack, which is very important as we understand. And on top of that, it shows the adversary that you have credible military forces, right? You can do all the exercises you want, but things that are gathered by secret means are often more credible to the adversary than things they can simply read about in The Economist. And so there's always that kind of sense of deterrence through transparency. That stuck with me because it raises some kind of quite interesting questions about the PRC-US relationship today on the intelligence front. And I think we see very clearly what happens when good intelligence is lacking. We have situations like October 7th, where Israel is taken by surprise. We see the worst attack on Jews anywhere since the Holocaust, the most sort of incredibly bloody day. And it's a profound, catastrophic, traumatic intelligence failure that Israel is still grappling with. But on the other hand, if you're China, paradoxically, you also have something of an incentive to show the US that you are not planning an invasion of Taiwan if your intentions really are bona fide, if your intentions really are good. So intelligence is kind of, I think, this really interesting commodity in global affairs whose importance is not fully understood until the moment that it completely breaks down catastrophically. And then we all understand, that's why we needed to understand what was going on.
Do you think that the status quo of not really discussing intelligence remains viable in our world of open source information? Or do you subscribe to what perhaps we saw with the US declassifying secret intel leading into Russia's invasion of Ukraine to help with more trust in our societies in combination with helping to be a deterrent on the likes of Russia and China?
Open source intelligence, or OSINT, or OSINT, as some people might say, is remarkable enough that we don't need to overstate what it can do. Let's think back to sort of February 2022. You remember those febrile, tense weeks ahead of the Russian invasion. And there's that amazing moment a few hours before the war in which I think it's Jeffrey Lewis of the Middlebury Institute realizes through Google Maps traffic data that basically the Russian army is invading Ukraine, hours before Vladimir Putin comes on television and announces it. So he has done, tactical warning of strategic armed attack, something that intelligence agencies spent billions of dollars doing in the Cold War through sort of radio frequency analysis, direction finding. And he's done it using open Google Maps data just by watching it. That's astonishing.
Yeah.
And you and I could name dozens of other feats of OSINT that have wowed us over the years, I'm sure. But let's also be very clear. Open sources did not steal and acquire Russian war plans in the autumn of 2021 like the US intelligence community did, because they couldn't. Open sources did not pick up the fact that Russia was moving blood plasma to the front lines in the middle of January in a product that has a shelf life and indicates a ticking clock on invasion. Open sources didn't pick that up at all. And there are a great many things like that which open sources simply cannot pick up again and again. They simply can't do it. So we should be focusing on taking the burden off the agencies in areas where they don't need to be spending time on stuff. And I think one example of this is battle damage analysis in war in some cases. I think what the outside community has done with assessing Russian losses in Ukraine has been spectacular. And I'm not saying the intelligence agencies need to give up on that task completely, but actually it's done to a pretty high standard outside it. The question, and here I think this connects to something else that sort of Chris Taylor wrote a few weeks ago for you guys on the importance of secret cloud, I think it was, and how secret cloud architectures are developing. The real challenge, Justin, as you probably remember from your time in the community, is that in the secret world, things are on the high side, the classified side, or the low side, the unclassified side. And it's actually surprisingly difficult, and here you have more experience than I do, to sometimes connect those things. So if you have wonderful, exquisite secret information on the movement of Russian intelligence officers, but you also have vast amounts of open data on airline records, on travel records, on other things, sometimes fusing that kind of thing can be quite difficult because you have limited amounts of secret compute. You can't pull some of your classified questions onto the low side because that's a vulnerability. And that's the challenge, I think, for our time, which is how do we make the best out of open, public, commercial sources whilst leveraging them alongside, fusing them with the very best that intelligence has to offer, which is still head and shoulders above what you can get in key, vital cases in the public domain.
Really well said. And I agree that really the key here for us as democracies going forward is how we're going to best utilize a combination of the intel agencies and the open source world. And I love your phrase in terms of how do we take the burden off our agencies to avoid a situation where the volumes of information online, we just can't afford for them to be so distracted with what we can all see that it takes them away from what only they can see. So that combo, I think, is going to be important. It perhaps takes me into a slightly different area, but related in terms of what the majority of people around the world are relying on to get what they see as their news or their information, and that's social media. It's clearly playing a big role in an increase in distrust in our societies. We've just had last week the Director General of our security organisation, ASIO, increase our terror threat level, in part due to technology and social media helping to increase tensions and conflict within our society. Are we seeing, Shashank, a disconnect between what is legal offline and what is being tolerated online? And is it the fate of the original failure to regulate at all, whether it was the internet or then social media as they were developing? Is this failure coming home to roost now as we see online fractures and fissures leaking into the real world? We're seeing from Australia what's happening in the UK. We watch as social media owners like Elon Musk claim that any regulation is an attack on free speech. We also see much loved and influential figures like Rowan Atkinson and John Cleese worried that government overreaction can go too far to not just regulate illegal content, but act as a moral police that takes us down a path of censorship and authoritarian-like rules. So it's a wicked balance, of course, but can you take us through where you see the current situation of how the development of the internet, social media, is impacting that long-standing balance of freedom of speech versus intimidation and incitement of violence?
Well, Justin, I profess no expertise here, but it's a timely question, both for reasons you touch on, which is the Australian terror threat being raised, but also here in the UK, as your listeners will be well aware, we've had very bad race riots, very, very unpleasant race riots, and they have really highlighted some of the questions that you raise. And I think your point about the disjuncture between the legality of offline and online activity gets at the heart of it. At a very personal level, I have received a torrent of racial abuse online in response to comments made about these riots and about the situation in the UK. And it does strike me that if someone walked down the street to my face and called me a racial slur and told me to go back to my country and made threats at me, they would be at risk of an aggravated racial disorder offense. They would be at risk of arrest. And we have laws for those things for good reason in your country and mine, even though, we have a sensible balance between what is reasonable speech and dissent and protest and what is harassment and what is abuse. Online, it is more of a free for all. And on one of the most popular platforms of all, X, formerly known as Twitter, of course, those rules have been breaking down more rapidly in the past 2 years since Elon Musk's purchase of the platform. He's not solely responsible for that, and these problems have long persisted on the website. But it's clear that the moderation system for this has broken down, and that the level of overt racial abuse and incitement to violence has been going up, most clearly in the sense that the rumors which triggered our race riots over the identity of a man who murdered 3 little girls in the town of Southport, false rumors that were spread, that they were spread on social media, on X and other websites. But I'd note a couple of things. One is that the law still can catch up, right? The law can catch up. And we actually have seen the arrest of people who triggered some of these rumors and effectively conducted the equivalent of shouting fire in a crowded theater. Secondly, I think it's important to understand that there's a national problem here within our countries as to how we strike this balance. What do we permit? What do we not permit? How do we allow legal, legitimate protest against immigration, which is not illegal, crossing over into a sort of aggravated incitement to violence? But there's, in a way, an equally important international dimension to this, which is that our standards for policing this speech differ greatly from country to country, even within our shared Anglophone communities, but beyond it particularly. And we have seen this really clearly in the last few years, where a country like India, for instance, has conducted aggressive takedown of footage, videos, social media posts, either highly critical of the government or that they feel are encouraging separatism. Content that would be legal, Justin, in your country, in my country, but the Indians deem to be a threat to public order. In fact, we've even seen them take down, as I think you'll recall, an ABC documentary on Indian harassment of Sikh separatists abroad, including in Australia. And that was a very sobering moment for many of us because, India, here's India, a strategic ally, a partner against China, the world's biggest democracy. And yet the rules by which it is operating in taking some of this content down, also in other areas like shutting the internet off, are so different from those that we are applying. And that international dimension, I don't think we are going to see resolved anytime soon. In other words, we are seeing, just as we are in so many other areas of economic and social life, more of a focus on sovereign action, on sovereign capability, on the ability to close your borders, localize your data, control what information your citizens get. I think that is still the path we are headed down.
Really well spoken, Shashank, and it is absolutely horrid and awful to hear the abuse that is coming your way. Incredible to think that people are effectively saying that they've got a level of freedom to say what they like because they don't like what you're saying. A, it's hypocrisy, but B, I think the importance of what you're saying is that we need to retain our principles of being able to truly say we have freedom of speech. And as you say, have the ability to protest and to say that we have different views, but without that turning into illegal behavior. It's a wicked challenge. In part, what you're saying about all our different rules that we have, it somewhat works in the offline world, Shashank, because we are able to have different rules within our countries. And we're able to say to people, when you come to Australia, you've got to abide by the Australian laws. And when Australians go overseas, it's a key part of the advice to Australian travellers that they've got to operate within the laws of the other countries they're in. With the online world, it makes it that much harder when you're dealing with people around the world. But I think a starting point would be for each of us as countries to say that at least within Australia, we should have the same rules that apply offline to people in Australia to online. And so if you can identify the people who are breaching those rules, there should be consequences and punishment for them. We shouldn't just say, oh, we'll throw up our hands and it's just the anarchy online means we can't do anything about it.
There's just one other coda to that I'd add, Justin, which is that compounding all of this is the fact that we want to protect legitimate, organic, free speech by our nationals. But in the digital world, our adversaries are also making that problem much harder by injecting themselves into these debates, often in covert and malign ways. And that's a subset of a much broader foreign interference problem that needs no explaining to Australians. But I see it, all of us grappling with it more and more. For instance, we've just had the case this week where the Trump campaign has said it's been hacked by Iran, that they've published data on opposition research into the vice presidential nominee, J.D. Vance, online. And this, of course, takes all of us back to 2016, which is How do I, as a journalist, if given material like this, deal with it? On the one hand, it may be newsworthy, and if it was given to me by a domestic source, it would be worthy of publication. On the other hand, I cannot be complicit in an Iranian or indeed a Russian or a Chinese influence operation that is laundering information via our free press. And Thomas Ridd's book, Active Measures, is extremely good on the history of this, if anyone hasn't read it. But they are weaponizing our free press and our free speech against us. And that's an additional challenge in all of this. How do we know, as particularly as sort of, the means of AI generated disinformation becomes more advanced, more sophisticated? I reported a few weeks ago on the first Russian use of AI to translate articles into different languages, particularly French, and spread them. They would take legitimate news articles and rewrite them using ChatGPT in ways spun to accentuate the anti-Western or anti-French element of this. So how do we, in a way, filter our information sphere to make sure that we are allowing the right speech through, but monitoring and blocking adversarial influence that is basically taking advantage of that? I haven't got an answer to that. I don't think anyone has a great answer to that right now, but it's a problem that we really, really need to think about.
Completely agree. And I think we're at a point where we need to work collectively as countries, whether it's through the G7 or some other form of the great democracies around the world coming together, because unfortunately, this is an issue that is having a disproportionate impact on democracies, given we have had for so long ideals of freedom and openness that are our great attribute, but are now becoming a great vulnerability for those countries. I think you and I have spoken about this before, but we just can't keep making the same mistakes. The not so great answer that Bill Clinton gave in 1999, 2000, when he was asked about, was he worried about what China would do on the internet, on the World Wide Web? And his answer was, it's impossible. It'd be like controlling the internet, it would be like nailing Jello to a wall. He actually wished China good luck. And then, of course, we've seen what China and Russia have done with the internet. And then with the Arab Spring, I think for valid reasons, the assessment was that social media would be too anarchic for controlling authoritarian regimes. But China and Russia again saw the threat, they adapted, and they're using that very technology against us. So I think, again, it comes back to what you said at the beginning, that this new era of technology that we're in, that's impacting all of our lives. I don't know that we can afford to make the same mistake that we've made with the internet, with social media, as we go towards such an advanced level of machine learning. Effectively, what you're referring to in your report is a technological takeover of our lives. So much of our lives are done either online or through technology. So can I ask you on that, do you subscribe to the long-standing assessment that no matter the development in tech and with machine learning, that machines would only assist rather than replace humans? With what you're seeing with where technology is going, does that assessment still hold, or are we at a point where artificial intelligence will not only assist humans, but it means that we actually won't be required unless humans choose to maintain a certain level of control?
This is so fascinatingly analogous to the debates I see in the military realm, Justin, on, how far should AI enable commanders? Should it just be guiding them, offering up options, saying, hey, I've spotted 10 Russian missile launchers? Should it be presenting a menu of options and the commander just says yes or no? Should it just be allowed to get on with it itself on the basis that it's more reliable and accurate than a human commander would be under conditions of time pressure and fatigue? In the loop, on the loop, off the loop. In a way, these questions are also applicable in the intelligence realm, although in many cases you could argue there's less immediately lethal consequences, but intelligence, as you know, is part of a kill chain very often and can lead to lethal decisions. So the orthodox view is that absolutely it's an augmentation. It's a human-machine team. And the best example of this is satellite analysis, right? I interviewed for this piece Jim Hockenhull, who was a former head of defense intelligence here, and now he's head of strategic command, and Trey Whitworth, who runs America's National Geospatial Intelligence Agency. And they both point out the AI is making them vastly more productive and efficient. So, Jim Hockenhull told me that in the past, you began your shift. I don't know if you ever did GeoInt, Justin, but if you began a shift at 7:30 a.m., you pour through your images and you might get to the one that you need, showing you that blasted Iranian radar at like 1 p.m. at lunchtime, and you've wasted the morning. And he said now, and I'm quoting here, he says, throughout my career, intelligence analysts used to spend 80% of their time wrangling the information, 20% adding value. In the geospatial world, we have been able to flip that. In other words, the algorithm just tells you, hey, You asked me to look for Iranian radars. Here's what I think's the Iranian radar. Look at this one. And the human then looks at it. Maybe they task a more advanced reconnaissance asset to go look at it in more detail. Maybe they ask other agencies to say, hey, do you have any information on this area? But the point is, it has done a kind of tipping and queuing. It has tipped and queued the analyst to go do something useful. And there's a common view in the intelligence communities that says there's always going to be a limit to this process. And one example of this is Trey Whitworth, who told me, look, yes, you can compare this to facial recognition algorithms, which are amazing, but he said a face makes up 80% of the field of view. A missile in the forest in a corner of a satellite image, we're looking at, he said, 2/100,000th of a percent. Right? So it's a tiny little bit of that image you're operating on. And he said the algorithm is always going to be an entry level analyst. I heard the same kind of message from GCHQ's chief data scientist who spoke at the Alan Turing Institute in the UK here recently, published a paper on this as well, where he said large language models like ChatGPT are going to be confined to the early stages of drafting. Quote, an extremely junior analyst, because they can't do counterfactuals. They can't do lateral thinking in his argument. I have to say, in a long-winded way to get back to your question, I'm a little more skeptical of these quite conservative views. I think that actually we could push the boundary more. I'm when I talk to people working with frontier models, working with next generation models, familiar with these things, they think that the intelligence communities are sometimes being too conservative. That's partly to do with culture, right? The cost of getting it wrong is very high. It's partly to do with bureaucracy and technology, right? Your IT systems in the intelligence community are subject to the same bureaucratic impediments and problems as those in any other aspect of government in many cases. So I still think that we can imagine as AI advances, things like large language models, multimodal models, doing a lot more of what is today's intelligence work, including traditional human work, like developing an asset, recruiting an asset, persuading them, coming up with the right psychological approaches to persuade them. I can see AI models doing a lot more of that than we are right now comfortable envisioning. But I think that may only become clear with aggressive experimentation, which is what we need to be doing. And that's why this new national security memorandum that's on the desk of Joe Biden right now is so interesting, because it urges the intelligence community in the US to experiment aggressively with frontier models, but with certain guardrails and certain prohibitions to give them the freedom to say, don't do that. You be very careful with what you do here, but the rest of it, I want you to really push the AI to the extreme to make sure that we're not going to be surprised in an unpleasant way by what the Russians and the Chinese and the others have been able to do with these things. So in other words, I guess I'm saying I see even, sort of more possibilities, more opportunities here than perhaps we fully appreciate at this point in time.
Yeah, it's really fascinating. I think it's vital for us as Western societies to make sure we know what is possible and what we can do with technology, even if our principles means we're not going to use technology in a particular way. We need to desperately understand how our adversaries who don't stick to the same rules and principles and ethic principles that we do. So that phrase of yours of aggressive experimentation is vital. Of course, we so often have a culture of, as you say, not allowing mistakes, and it can lead to risk aversion. And as we fight amongst ourselves, whether it be online and what rules there should or shouldn't be on social media, what principles should be around artificial intelligence development, our adversaries like Russia and China are just carrying on. So I think very much that there is that need again to be able to have that confidence to have aggressive experimentation. It means, I think, very much our conservative politicians across the board need to be encouraged to bring the public along with us, explain that we need to experiment and that things aren't always going to be perfect, but there are sets of principles that means there are those guardrails. So I think that is going to be really important. What you talk about in terms of where AI is going and where the development is, it suggests to me, Shashank, that we might actually see a future where it's possible that humans become effectively labourers only, implementing the decisions of machines. And in the sporting context, where it may very well be that humans are the players, but really if everything around the players, the coaches, those who determine game day strategy, post-game recovery, that could all be determined by technology if we don't stay in control of it ourselves. In relation to the battlefield, as you said, tech on the battlefield, again, your report so expertly takes us through that. Take us through what you mean by the war in Ukraine has become an accelerator of experimentation, to match your view on we need to be aggressive with that. How has Ukraine shown that?
I could talk to you for hours about that, because war, as we know, is this great forge of innovation, isn't it? Right? People are desperate. They junk peacetime bureaucracy and rules. They take risks. Their lives depend on it. There's a kind of survival mechanism at work here. Let's just take a couple of examples, right? It's been an accelerator of experimentation for Western countries dealing with Ukraine. And the example I would give you there is, I talked about the automation of certain types of image recognition and satellite recognition. Well, one of the questions is, can you take not just a picture of a satellite image and say, here's a tank, here's an armored vehicle, that's a T-72, that's a T-90M, but can you also say, based on the tanks I see here, based on the layout, based on the size of the barracks I can see adjacent to them, this is in fact a battalion tactical group. And you can view it as a coherent whole. Immediately you see the point, right, Justin? We're going from kind of very low order tasks, recognize an object, to higher order tasks, recognize the formation. And you can imagine even higher order tasks being, now tell me where you think the formation has come from and where it will go, based on perhaps its electronic emissions picked up from radio frequency satellites, based on the amount of losses it suffered and what we know about public databases on which battalions are at which strength. At the beginning of the war in Ukraine, in the UK at least, according to people I spoke to involved with defense intelligence, that wasn't possible at that level. There was no automated order of battle analysis. They were experimenting, they were trying to do this stuff, they were looking at it. And as far as I understand, significant progress has now been made. And part of the reason for that is, Justin, that military formations, as you know, they deploy in predictable ways, right? A Russian battalion, particularly in a conscript-heavy army where people need careful instructions, they need rules, they need procedures, they need rule books, doctrine manuals. And so tanks will be laid out in a certain way. You'll have a certain number of armored vehicles. You'll have a field hospital of a certain size if it's a brigade headquarters, blah, blah, blah. And so AI is kind of well suited to that. But Ukraine has been an enabler of that. One other example I'll give you, which is that the US agencies were experimenting with automation for a long time. In fact, I won't go into this now, but experimenting with it since the 50s, right? Or the 60s, where the flood of satellite imagery is making them drown, and they're beginning to experiment with the very early neural networks in the form of the perceptron. But I won't go down that rabbit hole unless you want me to in a minute. And what they realize is we can do really good object recognition. If it's a tank, a jet on an airfield, really, really easy. But they hadn't trained the model for destroyed equipment, for a mangled tank. And suddenly, when a war begins, guess what? You have a lot of mangled tanks. And so this tells you, the models that we build will be built with the assumptions we put into them, the assumptions about what we need. What are we going to be surprised by? Let's say if you're Australia and you're then involved in a contingency in the Pacific, what kind of problems will you need? And are your models today fit for purpose? If Taiwan deploys its missile launchers in a very particular way in its mountainous areas, and you're the PRC, are your models coping with that? Do they have the right quantity of synthetic aperture radar imagery, for instance, that can penetrate foliage and spot the metallic returns of certain hidden things in the woods? So this is a very human enterprise. The machines can still do incredible things, but the humans have to know what to ask of them, what to build into them. And that is where the experimentation comes in. And that is where the crucible of a war is so significant in pushing all of that along.
You refer to, in particular, the 60s, the period there of aggressive innovation by our American allies. Obviously, in that moment, in that era, they were being driven by what was viewed as an existential threat. They were, in many respects, losing in some areas of technology. We'd had the Sputnik moment, which resulted in a surge from the Americans. I suppose what's interesting is that I think we're in real danger of not doing anything until we have another Sputnik moment, but without us realizing that we've actually had many of them, and the moment is now to ourselves re-energize and come together in a way to bind as democracies. Do you think that one of the advantages that the Americans had in the 60s, notwithstanding, this is the irony, that there wasn't the internet, there wasn't the availability of all that open source information, but there was a way to message to society that there was such a threat that the government needed to invest in these areas. It's almost as though now we have the reverse, that we've got so much information available to the public, but the message is not being able to be communicated, that we are in a period now of real threats, not just from our internal disputes and internal tensions, but as you've said, the abuse of them by foreign adversaries. So do you think that what we're missing is that ability to message our own public to say, we just can't afford to wait for the next Sputnik moment, we've got to invest now?
I think there's a couple of things. I'm not a sociologist, but I would hazard a guess that we live in lower trust societies than we did in that period. So that's possibly part of it. Trust in government has fallen in many countries. I don't mean to sort of play up to the Chinese caricature of the West as sort of dissolute and degenerate societies where no one trusts the government. But trust in government has taken a knock in the last 10 years. And certainly in Europe and the United States, the financial crisis, the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, governance failures, these have all played a role in that process. So it is harder for government to make the case. I think part of it is also, the magnitude of the problem is difficult to convey. And that's because if you think about the audience listening to those American messages in the 50s and 60s saying, hey, Sputnik has just come over our heads. Some of that was exaggerated, right? We remember the ICBM gap that didn't exist and that was effectively manufactured for political reasons, but some of it was very real. But a couple of weeks ago, I read the report by the National Defense Strategy Commission, which is a bipartisan congressional commission designed to scrutinize the U.S. national defense strategy for the administration, which was published, I think, a couple of years ago. And it says at the end, it's a very sober read because it says America's not ready for a multi-front war. The US military is just not equipped for this. And it says the US public, again, I'm quoting here, are largely unaware of the dangers the United States faces or the costs required to adequately prepare. They do not appreciate the strength of China and its partnerships or the ramifications to daily life if a conflict were to erupt. They have not internalized the costs of the United States losing its position as a world superpower. And to go back to your comparison, the society today does not have in living memory examples of the homeland coming under attack, of sabotage, of missile strike, of the Blitz. It doesn't have those reference points so vividly at the back of their heads of a great power war. We are living in the hangover of this long peace dividend in which not only has the world been at peace for us, but our homeland has been an absolute sanctuary. And that is now completely changing. And so persuading the public of that is going to be much more difficult than it was to persuade a public who had seen V2 rockets, who had seen countries in Europe collapse and cease to exist. It's a much more difficult social proposition.
Yeah, absolutely it is. And it really is, I think, a test for governments and broader institutions that as there's been increased transparency in our societies with access to information, that there's actually, unfortunately, increased distrust. I do think it comes back to that double concern. We've got the aim of foreign adversaries like Russia and China, that their objective is to outcompete and defeat our intelligence agencies. And that's being assisted by more people in our own societies falling for conspiracy theories, including the existence of what some refer to as the deep state, which aids and abets that distrust. We've seen, whether it be MAGA Republicans, Trump himself, anarchic libertarians, radical socialists, and academics refer to the deep state. And it shows that it's a circle of distrust rather than just a left-right line of a political divide. So that suspicion itself on the intel community is really only helping our foreign adversaries and their masters at taking advantage of it. It's something that I don't think you and I are going to solve it on this podcast, but the governments have to come together, don't they, Shashank, and ask themselves, how do we rebuild that trust?
Yes, I think that part of this is lessons learned, right? I'm thinking here of when we reflected on foreign interference, the UK and the US learned a lot from Australia's examples of dealing with that problem a few years ahead of us on terms of how we craft our foreign interference laws, how we ensure that this doesn't spill over into harassment of minority communities, of how we, monitor these problems, all of those things. Lessons were so important, learning from partners. In the spirit of that, I think actually we have a lot of that to do again. Learning from the Americans, for example, as to how they dealt with the aftermath of 2016 in dealing with electoral interference and hack and leak operations. Learning from the American press on how they learned how not to cover those hack and leak operations. But also in societies that have been dealing with some of this for much more intense ways for much longer than we have. And I'm thinking here of Finland, Sweden, Estonia, the other Baltic states, the Poles. These are societies that are relatively high trust societies. So they kind of begin with a slightly different social inheritance than we do in some cases. But nonetheless, they've invested a great deal in critical thinking skills, in counter disinformation, in how to call out problems at an early stage and signal frankly and honestly with their public when problems occur. So I think that the starting point for this, as you allude to, Justin, is just looking at us across allies, because alliances, the fact that we have friends and partners, this is the big thing that the Chinese and the Russians really don't, right?
Yeah.
We have that huge collective strength of experiences and of other things, but we must get the best practice from all of these cases as best we can. And so countries that are introducing laws on social media or automated monitoring or attempts to try to say, here's how we rebut allegations made by threat actors in real time, how are those experiences going? How are they effective? Are they working? Are they not working? What's going well? What's going less well? How do we borrow these examples and take them across different areas? It's got to be a learning experience.
Completely agree. Completely agree. We could talk for hours across a range of these subjects, Shashank, but maybe we might just need to do multiple podcasts. But let me try and end with just a few rapid fire questions, which again could have long answers, but see if you've got any glimmers of hope here. With Russia's war on Ukraine, which we've talked about from a learning of technologies advancement perspective, where do you see the war in Europe headed in the next year?
Well, I'm, like everyone else, have been considerably surprised by Ukraine's incursion into Kursk province, which has upended our assumptions about what is possible and Ukraine's offensive options. But I'm still fairly sober about it. I don't think the Kursk operation will necessarily result in huge long-term gains for Ukraine. I still think Ukraine's doing this in part out of desperation because it can't change the front lines, which are quite sticky and static. Their position in eastern Ukraine is still very bad around the town of Pokrovsk and deteriorating. And so all in all, I think that we are unlikely to see any significant Ukrainian offensive that will change the front lines within Ukraine. I think that the prospect for talks is fairly grim. The Russians are gearing up for a long war economy in which they feel they can still grind Ukraine down, and that they will still only accept a deal that is highly unfavorable to the Ukrainians and that would likely result in the eruption of another conflict quite soon. So whoever wins, whether if it's Trump, I think that the prognosis is quite bad because we would be facing a significant likelihood of the cutoff for Ukraine. But even under a Harris administration, even if there was an appetite to open up negotiations with Russia, I am not optimistic that we would see any serious success. So my baseline assumption, Justin, is that we're going to be, we reconvened in a year's time, this war is still going to be continuing, and the front lines are going to be not dissimilar to those that they are today.
All right, so prospects for talks in the short term grim there, and interesting delineation there between the possibility under a Trump administration versus a Harris administration. What about the war in the Middle East? It's in a delicate phase at the moment. Are you more optimistic about the prospects for talks there, or do you think it will continue to expand before it de-escalates?
I'm sorry, I'm such a downer at parties for this reason. I'm afraid I'm still incredibly gloomy. I know there's sort of ceasefire talks occurring as we speak, and these are at a very advanced stage, but I'm kind of pessimistic that either side really is committed to this, that the Benjamin Netanyahu government is willing to make the significant concessions necessary. Hamas looks quite uninterested, and the killing of Ismail Haniyeh, their political leader, has also caused a lot of disruption. And indeed, I still think, despite talk that Iran has postponed its retaliation against the assassination of Haniyeh in Tehran, I still think that we are looking at an imminent Iranian retaliation against Israel, direct attack on Israel from both Iran and Hezbollah, and that's going to plunge us into another cycle of violence. I think it will come. I think it might have occurred by the time listeners are listening to this, but I certainly think, we're looking at sort of days, not weeks. And all in all, we are trending absolutely in the wrong direction in the Middle East.
There's a cross there for Europe and a cross there for the Middle East. Let's not leave the Indo-Pacific out of the equation here. Obviously, we've got China watching on, hoping that the Americans are going to be distracted in both those other theatres. Where do you see China taking its aggression in this region, in particular against the likes of the Philippines and Taiwan?
Well, as you know, what ties both those flashpoints together is the common Chinese approach, which is a steady, incremental ratcheting up of military and a sort of non-military coercion against those countries. In the Taiwan case, in the form of increasing numbers of flights across the median line, increasing naval activity, increasing hints about the preparation for blockades. And in the Philippines case, particularly around Second Thomas Shoal, but now around some other flashpoints as well, the interference with supply ships, the sort of very cautious approach. I think the encouraging thing here, though, Justin, is particularly in the Philippines, the Chinese have not gone all out. Deterrence is still operating, right? They're still looking very closely, particularly at what the US is doing here. The US has sent aircraft carriers to the Philippines in the last 6 months to exercise. The Chinese are still seeing what can they get away with. They're flirting with calculated, localized, targeted violence and intimidation, whether that's water cannoning ships, ramming them. In the case of Australia, we saw sonar used against Australian divers. But there is a kind of calibrated quality to this. They are looking to see what the response is. They're looking to see what allies do collectively. And in the Philippines, I think they are still quite cautious because they understand that despite all these other problems around the world, in the Middle East, in Europe, that the Americans are still not a force to be trifled with in a contingency like this, despite the fact that China's military capabilities have grown so much. So all in all, this shows us that deterrence is still operating and our response still makes a big difference to the Chinese activity.
Well, slightly more encouraging there. Does your buoyancy there about deterrence holding, does that differ depending on what you see in front of us with a Trump or Harris presidency?
I think we need a lot to learn about what a Harris presidency would look like. What would her national security team look like? The likelihood is we would see quite a bit of continuity, particularly on the big questions around competition with China, the emphasis on geoeconomics. I'd be surprised if we saw a dramatic shift on that. With Trump, there's much greater unpredictability, right? And so the Chinese don't know whether, in response to provocations, he would simply look to cut a deal to sort of show himself as a great deal maker, or whether he would escalate in unpredictable and irascible ways, as he is liable sometimes to do. But what I worry most about in the event of a Trump presidency is abandonment of Ukraine, setting a terrible precedent, causing huge problems for Europe, causing great concern among allies over American staying power, and impetuous, reckless policies in the Middle East, including support for military action against Iran or Lebanon, that would result in the absorption of US military resources there. And China might then see opportunities opening up for calculated aggression in Asia. And that is what worries me the most about a Trump presidency.
I think this question of abandonment of Europe or reduction of support for NATO for Ukraine, I think that's the one that countries like the UK and Australia need to come together. And if there is a Trump presidency and there are people around him who are genuinely arguing that the United States can't fight on three fronts, that they can't fight in Europe, they can't fight in Middle East and in the Indo-Pacific, and it is a genuine burden that we're asking of the United States. But for those people around Trump or even Harris saying that we need to reduce our level of support and engagement in Europe and concentrate on China because China is the pacing challenge, I think we owe it to ourselves, and in particular from an Australian perspective in this region, to say to the next American president that abandoning Europe won't prove to China that the Americans are focused more on China, even if they temporarily move more resources into this region. It will simply prove that Beijing is right, that the West and the US and democracies don't have stamina. And it will really feature in China's narrative within the region that Southeast Asia and the Pacific can't trust the United States and its allies to be here for the long term, and they're stuck with China, whether they like it or not. So I think that's where, again, just as the answer is in our concerns about the threats of technology, is to come together, learn the lessons, and try and improve ourselves and work on what works better. That's the same here, that this is where Australia and the UK, its AUKUS partners, needs to say to the Americans, don't abandon one friend, even if it's with the intentions of increasing support to another. Shashank, it's been absolutely fantastic. We could talk for hours. Your level of knowledge across the range of topics is, quite frankly, extraordinary. I like to end many podcasts with a bit of a question posed around a book review. And apart from everything that you've written, in particular your latest article, You mentioned, of course, Thomas Ridd's wonderful book, Active Measures. What would you recommend our listeners, if they're interested in any of the topics that we've talked about today or anything on your mind, go out and read?
I would recommend my favorite book on intelligence, and particularly on human intelligence, and that is The $1 Billion Spy by David Hoffman, who is a great journalist, a great author. He wrote a wonderful book called The Dead Hand as well on the Soviet biological weapons program. And The $1 Billion Spy is a story of the CIA's recruitment of Adolf Tolkachev, a great Soviet radar engineer in the 80s. And he was recruited and run remarkably in Moscow, which kind of gets to my point about denied areas, hard target countries, and the challenge of doing intelligence under forbidding conditions of tight, suffocating surveillance. And it's a wonderful book, both as a kind of example of what human intelligence can achieve, but also a great story of technology. And it's an age in which you have, gadgetry like the CIA's Jack in the Box, which is a repurposed sex toy. They put it in the front seat of their car, they turn a corner, the CIA officer rolls out the car, and the driver presses a button and the Jack in the Box springs up in the passenger seat, making it look to the KGB surveillance as if the guy's been in the car the whole time. Or little earpieces which show you when the KGB surveillance frequencies are near you. So it's a wonderful example of that kind of tradecraft and technology, and it's based on declassified CIA cables between the Moscow station and Langley. So I highly recommend it, and I think it illuminates a lot of these questions about the interplay between technology and intelligence.
A wonderful recommendation of The $1 Billion Spy by David Hoffman. Shashank Joshi, the Economist defense editor, it's been an absolute pleasure. I hope that we bring you back shortly, because there are about 7 or 8 more pods that we seem to have lined up already in this one. So thanks very much, and welcome back soon.
Thank you very much for having me. It's been a fantastic conversation. I look forward to continuing the conversation soon.
And that's all we have time for today, folks. Thanks for listening. And for those attending the Sydney Dialogue, we'll see you there.